Hi, this is Luis Bustamante, and I'm presenting Ella Baker and Kathleen Cleaver, a comparison of two highly influential women in the 20th century civil rights movement. Ella Baker is pictured to the left, Kathleen Cleaver is pictured to the right. And let's begin with with Ella Baker. So the picture to the left and to the right, that's Ella Baker. She was born in 1903 to a middle-class family in North Carolina. Now, Ella Baker, she was able to avoid a lot of the terrible the terrible Jim Crow treatment of the South, of the Deep South, the particularly terrible treatment from Jim Crow South due to her being born into a middle class family. However, she still experienced, the segregation of the very early 20th century up until, you know, 1964, where the Civil Rights Movement was passed, Civil Rights Act was passed. She still experienced all of that, the brunt of all of that. However, in spite of all of that, she was able to go to college, Shaw University specifically, where she got a bachelor's of arts, right? Now, thing about Ella Baker is throughout her entire life, up until her death in 1986, she was involved in various civil rights causes in the fight for African American civil rights. In fact, as I detailed right here, she laid the groundwork for for future women's movements, as well as a lot of nonviolent civil rights movements. Now, a big thing about Ella Baker that she brought to the civil rights movement is her de-emphasis from the what she viewed as the black elite. Now, what she viewed as the black elite, it was like highly educated, intellectuals, scholars that were involved in the civil rights movement. People such as W.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. She viewed that these guys were, men specifically as well, that these guys were they were elite, right? They were so far removed from the average African American or the average person that they were fighting for, because the average people that they were fighting for at the end of the day were lower class, were lower income, were, very likely poor and uneducated, right? So, like, one of her philosophies that her biographer, Ransby wrote, oppressed people, whatever their level of formal education, had the ability to understand and interpret the world around them and to move and transform them. So that's the way she viewed the impact of people of, uneducated or people who were not necessarily, um, highly skilled orators, intellectuals like Martin Luther King, W.B. Du Bois, people like Thurgood Marshall, right? And a lot of her foundations as well. She pushed for a lot of, for organization of students, of the community. She could push a lot for community organization in the forms of nonviolence. She pushed for a lot of nonviolence, as evidenced with her association with a lot of these communities. For example, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was a founder of which she was a founder. Never a member, but she served as as an advisor to the group. She brought a lot of her experience prior to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She had served in the NAACP. She had been a member of the SCLC, which she left both of these organizations due to her differences in beliefs about, that top down organization, right? That organ you know the As I had mentioned earlier, the black elite to the uneducated people. She believed that the bottom, essentially, could build the organization up, building the organization from the bottom up. Her dreams of this were achieved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was a student organization that focused on organizing the community, organizing students particularly, you know, and working for all kinds of change from like issues. I think she worked with women's rights. I think there was a moment in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's history around early 70s where they faced a big problem in the organization because they were addressing issues as well, like such as Palestine and the Palestine and Israel conflict. They were addressing like a vast majority of, you know, issues social issues that the United States was involved in, other people were involved in, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, things of that nature. Now, throughout all of this, she gained experience as an organizer, as a community organizer, right? And she worked very heavily through nonviolent protests. So now I think there's a big difference between peaceful and there's a big difference between peaceful and nonviolence. Obviously, her aim was to be disruptive, right? The in order to bring to attention causes that she was advocating for, but those protests were never violent. They were never. It was never armed struggle. She was more focused on protests than nonviolence and nonviolence. Right. On the other hand, we have Kathleen Cleaver, again, highly influential and laid very big groundwork. She was born in 1945. She's still alive to this day, right? So Kathleen Cleaver, similar to Ella Baker, well, she was born in Dallas, Texas, but similar to Ella Baker, her parents were, middle class, were part of the middle class community. However, Kathleen Cleaver's parents, they were academics and activists that had been working closely in like government aid offices around the world. So a lot of her childhood was spent in, for example, in South Asia, places like Vietnam, places like Cambodia, right? Africa, during a time in which many of these countries or many of these regions were undergoing decolonization efforts. People in those regions were taking back, control of their region, rejecting control from imperial or colonial powers such as Europe, such as England, France, the United States, right? So she witnessed a lot of this growing up in her formative years, right? Later, she went off to college, only stayed there for a year before she moved to New York to join the SNCC, the organization founded by Ella Baker. Later, she moved to California, like a few years after that, moved to California, and she joined the Black Panther Party. Now, through her involvement in various different organizations, you can see an evolution in Kathleen Cleaver's politics. So she was in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee from 1966 to 1967. You know, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, very focused on, nonviolence. She was a member. She was a secretary. She was a very influential organizer during that 1 year that she was with them. However, after a certain point, she met a fellow activist named Eldridge Cleaver. Eldridge Cleaver he was basically an African American militant involved with the Black Panther Party, living in California, which she moved out to California to visit him, decided she was all about the Black Panther Party, and decided to stay in California as a member of the Black Panther Party. Now, a big thing about Kathleen Cleaver's time in the Black Panther Party, right? She was the first woman to be considered a part of Black Panther Party leadership, right? She was the first woman to sit on the chair. She brought her experience, again, like much like Ella Baker, she brought prior experience in previous civil rights movements or civil rights organizations to augment her skills as an organizer with the Black Panther Party, right? However, as you can see, she moved from an organization focused on nonviolence to a more militant organization. She adopted more militant methods. For example, Eldridge Cleaver, I think around the 70s, 1971, had to flee the United States after being involved in a shootout with the police. A fellow Black Panther Party member, Bobby Hutton, was killed in this shootout. Kathleen Cleaver, followed her husband Eldridge to Algeria, where they stayed for a bit before returning to the United States, upon which Eldridge Cleaver was arrested for his involvement in that shootout. Right. So not only was she involved in this more militant organization, people around her took those militant steps, those revolutionary steps forward to in contrast to Kathleen to Ella Baker, who was stayed focused on nonviolence, stayed advocating for nonviolence. Um, Kathleen Cleaver did not finish college until way later, after her involvement with the Black Panther Party, after the Black Panther Party fell apart, after she no longer was deeply involved. In fact, after she had divorced Eldridge Cleaver, she then went back and finished her degree, but for the vast majority of her time working as an activist, she didn't have a college degree. She was one of the people Ella Baker sought to mobilize when Ella Baker was mobilizing the community, right? Ella Baker was an organizer. Kathleen Cleaver took the torch from Ella Baker and you know started organize became part of the community that Ella Baker had been meaning to mobilize, right? So these two women, they had a lot of very important similarities. I went over a lot of their differences, but they had a lot of similarities, right? Kathleen Cleaver and Ella Baker were both focused on community engagement and grassroots movements, rather than the big intellectual discussions, rather than the big, the scholarly debates. They were more focused on community engagement, grassroots movements, protests, stuff like that, instead of advocating in law, advocating in law discussions, advocating in academia. They said, let's get the community together. Let's get the community to fight for what they want. Another very important thing of what they fought for, is they also fought a lot against misogyny and patriarchy within the civil rights movement. The Black Panther Party, for example, very very misogynistic, very patriarchal. The NAACP, SCLC, uh, they had been focused on mythologizing charismatic male leaders, right? Ella Baker describes this as, the Black preacher, the Black scholar, right? These are highly educated guys that were very skilled orators. But for example, Ella Baker and Kathleen Cleaver, to an extent as well, felt that they were better at talking than mobilizing, right? That's one of the criticisms Ella Baker had of Martin Luther King, right? He's a really good speaker, not good at generating support, right? He needs organizers to do that for him. Whereas Ella Baker said, let's take away the focus from you know, these elevated figures, and let's bring it to the community and have the focus on all of us, right? They were both educated women from Black middle class families. Again, while Kathleen Cleaver did not finish college in her early life, similar to the way Ella Baker did, she did have a college education. She had gone to boarding school during her time when her family had moved to Atlanta for some time. She did do boarding school there, right? She was very educated, very aware of the world around her, right? Both very important organizers and pioneers within male dominated civil rights organizations. They laid the groundwork for women go into these to be able to go into these male dominated organizations and assume leadership roles, take control of the narrative, and also push feminist ideals into, like, combining it with African American rights, such, introducing intersectionality into this movement, right? Um, and I realize how ironic it is that I, as a man, am telling, am presenting on how um, important Ella Baker and Kathleen Cleaver were in taking away the misogyny and patriarchy present in the African American civil rights movement. But that is essentially what they did, and they gave a voice to a lot of women that we should be listening to now. Anyways, this is a direct quote from Kathleen Cleaver that embodies both the spirit that both Ella Baker and Kathleen Cleaver, they both embodied. This is something Kathleen Cleaver wrote later on in some of her blog posts. She's still alive, so she is now updated to more modern more modern methods of advocacy, right? So this is a quote by her, but nobody seems to pose the important question I had. Where can I go to get involved in the revolutionary struggle, right? It doesn't, to Ella Baker and Kathleen Cleaver, it doesn't matter status, doesn't matter, you know, your position in life, your circumstances of life. What matters is your willingness to get involved in the struggle, in the revolutionary struggle, if you will. Albeit there are differences in methodology, right? So the impacts that Ella Baker and Kathleen Cleaver had on the civil rights movement in general and American society overall. So many of their causes of the liberation of marginalized community and the proletariat, they were both they were both pretty like involved to varying degrees with socialists. Therefore, the use of the term proletariat. While many of their causes overlapped, Ella Baker and Kathleen Cleaver, they also represented a variety of beliefs and philosophies of the civil rights movements, methodologies, methods of organizing, et cetera, right? These were both incredibly influential, very radical women for their time, right? Very radical, introduced very radical politics, and they changed the way women participated in community politics. They built a role that women could occupy, and they took power away from misogyny, from patriarchy that was present in the civil rights movement, and took that power for themselves and gave a voice to a lot of women involved in those movements. These are the sources I used for to gather information on both Ella Baker, Kathleen Cleaver, and their involvement in the variety of organizations that they were involved. Um, Thank you very much for listening. Once again, my name is Luis Bustamante. My photo is in the very first slide if you were curious how I look like. And thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Oh, Jesus.